Hey folks, Sealer here. In today's video, I'll be talking about the new German destroyer branch announced by Wargaming a few days ago. This development blog article covers those ships as well as a couple of other non-German ships that are coming to the game. Just a reminder that everything on the blog is subject to change, and that especially applies here since newly announced ships often go through many changes before they reach their final form. So starting with the German destroyers, we will have a new branch starting from Tier 7 through Tier 10. This begins with the Tier 7 Z31. This is a modified class from the class that was led by the Z23, although the Z31 is at Tier 7 instead of Tier 8. At Tier 8, we have the Gustav, Julius, Merker. At Tier 9, we have the Felix, Schultz. And at Tier 10, we have the Elbing. These ships are characterized as sort of being mobile mini cruisers with accurate 150 millimeter guns, and that's frankly an understatement. We'll get to that here soon enough when we look at the parameters. They have powerful AP shells with good damage, penetration capability, and improved ricochet angles. Their HE, on the other hand, will be relatively moderate or frankly just not very good, which is pretty typical of German destroyers or German ships in general. And then they will all carry hydroacoustic search. And then starting at Tier 8, they have the defensive AA fire consumable. And they will not have smoke, nor will they have the engine boost consumable. Now, I'm going to have a few words to say about the defensive fire aspect, but I'll get to that here soon enough when we look at the parameters. The ships are characterized as having great armor for their class. Now, I don't know what this means. We don't have access to the armor profiles in this announcement. I don't know if this means that they have particular plating or other aspects of the ship that allow them to shatter or ricochet or otherwise sort of mitigate damage that might be fired at them because of their good armor. I don't know if this is something like we see with the Khabarovsk that has a 50 millimeter plate that covers a large portion of her side that can't even be penetrated by most 203 millimeter high explosive shells in the game. So I don't know if it's going to be like that or it's some other method. So we'll have to see how that works out, what exactly great armor for the class means. The torpedoes have a decent reload time and speed that's typical of German destroyers, but the damage is, quote, average, and frankly, that's being a little generous. The German destroyers tend to have among the poorest torpedo alpha in the game. Basically, mostly the European destroyers are the only ones that tend to have worse alpha. And the range is not very good. They can stealth torpedo, but again, we'll get to that here soon enough. Now, again, Wargaming characterizes the playstyle as, quote, mobile mini cruisers, with mainly relying on their strong AP and armor. So again, nobody's here played these, don't know exactly what this means. Now, Wargaming says their main targets will be new ships. For the new ships will be singled out targets, especially light cruisers, which can be damaged significantly by their AP shells. Now, part of that could be interpreted as they mainly fire at light cruisers or often fire at light cruisers as their main targets, but that also could imply that these are opportunists that are going after isolated targets that they can take down if they need to. It's not entirely clear here. To me, playing a destroyer, it's very important to be able to spot, to fight other destroyers, and to contest caps. And if the play style lends itself to opportunistic play where you kind of go off on an errand to go after an isolated target that may or may not be playing to the objective, is that really the best interest of playing or at least trying to win the game and playing for your team? I'm not entirely sure. Now, Wargaming characterizes that these new ships will not be effective in fighting for caps due to their high detectability range and lack of smoke. So their concealment is worse than most of their peers at each tier, but they're not straight up terrible to the point that they're like Soviet destroyers that have, 7-8 kilometer detection. They're not quite that bad. So they will definitely, players who play these will definitely need to be very situationally aware when it makes sense to go after caps. But by and large, I agree that these are probably not going to be the first ships to go to caps. They might back up other better concealed destroyers, especially those that have smoke, so that they can act as backup or support destroyers. Again, they're kind of like mini cruisers in a way, providing close support to the destroyers that are trying to take caps. Now, let me get to some details on these ships. The characteristics of the Z31 will be announced later, but they do have details for the Tier 8 through Tier 10 ships. So again, starting at Tier 8 with the Gustav Julius Merker, she has a very large hit point pool, 25,000. That is, I expect, by far and away the largest, certainly of Tier 8 destroyers, and most destroyers, even up to Tier 10, do not have a similar hit point pool. She will fire 5 150 millimeter guns and 5 turrets, single rifle per turret. Firing range will be 11.9 kilometers. And the HE shell damage is actually not too bad at 2,200. Now, the comparison I'm going to make for these 150 millimeter shells of these destroyers is to the 150 millimeter shells of the Nürnberg and the Königsberg, which also fire 150 millimeter shells. Now, the Nürnberg and Königsberg, the HE alpha is 1700, and the AP alpha is the highest of that caliber in the game at 3900. So for the Tier 8 Merker, her HE shell damage is actually higher than on the Königsberg and Nuremberg, and the fire chance is very strong at 12%. Now, the shell velocity is not very good, or is not typical for Germans. It's relatively floaty at 835 meters, so there's probably going to be some learning the ballistics for the ship based on the current parameters. And the AP shell damage is not quite as strong as the 3,900 for the Nuremberg and the Königsberg, but at 3,700, that's very good for that caliber as far as AP damage is concerned. Reload will be 6.5 seconds. Turrets are pretty sluggish. This is typical of German destroyers. They tend to have the second worst turret rotation in the game. Generally, only the Japanese have worse turret rotation on their guns. So either take an expert marksman skill, or just, frankly, the better thing to do is make sure that you're planning which side you need your guns on before you get to your target area. Dispersion, however, and Sigma are where these guns are really going to shine. Look at this dispersion, 57 meters at that maximum range. That is God tier. It's half the dispersion ellipse, or half the size of the dispersion ellipse of other destroyers, which tend to have 100 to 110, 120 meters at their maximum range. So very, very pinpoint accurate shells. So long as players are aiming well, these should be very much on target, and they'll almost see, I suspect, kind of feel unnaturally accurate if players aim well. Now, if players don't aim their shots well for any ship, the game artificially, in some sense, widens the dispersion of their shells so that they have at least some chance of landing shells on target. I don't know how that might affect these characteristics, given how accurate these are intended to be. But like I said, if you are aiming well, these should be extremely accurate guns, and the Sigma is excellent as well at 2.0. Now, for the Merker, her torpedo layout, or her torpedo tube layout, is somewhat unorthodox. She has a single center-mounted quadruple launcher, and then 2 double launchers, one on each side of the ship. Now, the torpedoes here are the same the individual torpedoes are the same across all of these ships. The Alpha is, again, quite poor at 13,700. Basically, these are the torpedoes from the Graf Spee. The range is 8 kilometers, the speed is 65 knots, which is reasonably quick, and the reload time is decent at 90 seconds. And the concealment on the torpedoes is also quite good at 1.3 kilometers. So for those of you, again, familiar with German torpedoes, you will understand these pretty well. And again, the range is better at 8 kilometers, and they will be able to stealth torpedo. Now, we get to the AA, and this is a part that I mentioned earlier I have a little bit of a beef with. So the America has the worst of the AA across the ships that are included in this, or at least the German destroyers included in this announcement. She has no long-range AA. She has only short and mid-range. The short range for all of these ships, as far as the hit points per second, is actually pretty good. But because it is short range, the planes, the opposing planes, are not going to be in the AA for very long, if at all, when they go to do their drops. So for the Tier 8 America, her short range is limited to 2 kilometers. And then for the Tier 9 and Tier 10, the range goes out to 3 kilometers for short range. And again, the mid range here is okay, but it's unremarkable at 98 hit points per second. And the maximum range on the AA altogether for this ship is only 3.5 kilometers. Now, the speed is 36 knots, which is okay, but again, doesn't get the engine boost. Where these ships, all of these ships, at least of the tech tree destroyers, have an issue is their turning circle radii and their rudder shift. They are pretty abysmal. So for Tier 8, it's 760 meters, which is not the worst in the game, but it isn't very good either. The rudder is also very sluggish at 5.5 seconds. That's sluggish for a destroyer. It's okay for a light cruiser. In fact, some light cruisers can be slightly faster, but for a destroyer, it's going to be very noticeable. Now, best concealment is going to be, I believe, 6.4 kilometers. This is 8.2 base. Yeah, so the ships are going to be reasonably, they're going to be out detected, I should say, by most of their peers, and the maneuverability is going to be pretty poor in some ways, especially the rudder and the turning circle. Now, they obviously receive damage control, and they also receive the German hydroacoustic search, which is good. But as I mentioned, they receive defensive AA fire, and I'm not clear how useful this is really going to be. I would gladly give up defensive fire and get, well, preferably engine boost. We've already seen that players are able to execute their destroyer gameplay without smoke. I would prefer to have engine boost to be able to move around the map more efficiently. As a destroyer, it's very important to be able to relocate to support your team effectively, and engine boost is, in my opinion, more useful to support the team than smoke is. So that is the America Tier 8. At Tier 9 with the Felix Schultz, her hit point pool is slightly smaller than at Tier 8 at 24,200, but this is still very large for a destroyer. She will fire 6 150 millimeter guns, 3 turrets, double rifle per turret, 12-kilometer range. Now here is where the shells are going to be more typical of Germans as far as HE. 1,700 base damage for the HE shells. That's the same again on the Nuremberg and Königsberg. Fire chance is 8%. Now the shell velocity is excellent. 960 meters per second out of the barrels is the same as on the Nuremberg and Königsberg. Folks familiar with the German light cruisers and their shell ballistics, they are rail guns for the first several kilometers, but then out past, well, 12 kilometers or so, they get pretty floaty because German shells are fairly light, and so they tend to lose more speed over distance than a lot of other nations' shells. So since the firing range here is maxed out at 12 kilometers, they are probably going to be pretty quick to target over the full range. Also identical to the Nuremberg and Königsberg is the AP shell damage at 3,900. Again, historically, this has been the highest AP alpha of all 150 millimeter or 150-ish millimeter shells in the game. So very good AP from that perspective. And the speed on the AP shells is the same at 960 meters per second. Reload is 7.5 seconds. And again, the turrets are pretty sluggish at 22.5 seconds for 180 degrees. The Sigma and especially the dispersion, again, God tier, 57 meters at the 12-kilometer range with a 2.0 Sigma. So again, laser accurate guns. The torpedoes are more conventional, two quadruple center mounted launchers, same damage, same speed, same range, same reload time as with Tier 8, and also will be for Tier 10. AA is better than on Tier 8. She at least gets long-range AA, so her her main battery acts as dual purpose. Now the short range again quite strong. Medium and long range are quite poor at 46 hit points per second. Again, I don't know how effective defensive fire is really going to make this unless they make it like a 1,000 time damage improvement per second or something ridiculous. But I really am not clear how useful defensive AA fire is going to be for these ships. Now, one shining aspect of the AA for the tier 9 and tier 10 is their long range AA is excellent at 6.9 kilometers. This is essentially the best, matches the best in the game across all ships. So maybe the hit points per second are poor, but because the planes have to be in the AA space longer, the defensive fire is more useful. Again, nobody's tested these. We'll have to see how that goes. Speed here is decent, or base speed at 37.5 knots, but again, does not get the engine boost consumable. Where things are really kind of a killer in terms of maneuverability, huge turning circle at 800 meters. That's terrible for a destroyer. Rudder shift, again, continues to be very sluggish at 5.3 seconds. And best concealment, I think, is 6.4. Let me double check that. Correction, 6.5 kilometers best concealment. So the Mercury at tier 8 is 6.4. The Felix Schultz is 6.5 best concealment. And then again, damage control, hydro, and defensive fire for consumables. Now for the Elbing, she has a stupidly huge HP pool for a destroyer, 30,900. That's the type of hit point pool we see here for tier 7 cruisers. So I went and did a cursory search. I think this is the largest hit point pool of all destroyers in the game, regardless of tier or nation. So just very, very large hit point pool. Again, same, very similar guns to the tier 9, the 650 millimeter rifles in double rifle turrets. The firing range is slightly longer at 12.3 kilometers. Same HE alpha at 1700. AP alpha is even higher at 4100. So if this holds, or these parameters hold, these will now become the highest alpha 150 millimeter level AP in the game. Again, same velocity on both the HE and AP shells at 960 meters per second. Reload is 7.5 seconds. And again, similar sluggish turrets at 22.5 seconds for 180 degrees. And again, same God tier dispersion at 58 meters at maximum range with a 2.0 Sigma. The torpedoes are the identical, except that it's now 2 quintuple launchers center mounted on the ship. AA is better for tier 10 than it is for tier 9. Very good short range. Better but unremarkable mid-range, and the long range again remains quite poor at 46 hit points per second. The range again is excellent, or for the long range at 6.9 kilometers. So again, kind of a mixed bag on the AA. Speed is okay, 36.2 knots. Turning circle is just a mind-numbingly huge 890 meters. That's battleship level turning circles. And a rudder that is abhorrently bad for a destroyer at 6.3. Again, 6.3 isn't bad for a cruiser, but it is going to be very noticeable for a destroyer. And then best concealment, I believe, is 6.6 kilometers at best with the skill upgrade and consumable. Same set of consumables as far as damage control, hydroacoustic search, although this hydro is the 6 kilometer hydro that the upper tier German cruisers, the Z-52, the Große Kurfürst, and the Friedrich der Große all receive. So it has very good hydro and again, defensive fire. So those are the parameters. Let me offer some opinions about how I think these will be played. When I was thinking through this, my thought process was think München, the premium tier 7 German light cruiser. That's kind of what this feels like this might end up going, but I have an issue with that. So in the München, it basically means, stealthing around with your very good concealment, setting up in positions where you can fire from concealment or fire against distracted targets. That's kind of the often the play style for many cruisers, not just the München. My issue with that for destroyers is if you are operating in a mode where you're trying to set up so that you can do damage from concealment, it basically means you're not spotting. It's the same frustration when you have destroyers that immediately smoke up when they go into caps, or they smoke unnecessarily because they just assume they're supposed to be in smoke, and they deny visibility for their team. And so to me, a key aspect of playing any destroyer is spotting for the team. The second is fighting other destroyers, and the third is being able to take caps. Now, taking caps in these ships is going to require much better situational awareness, again, because of their larger concealment and so on. But the other aspects in terms of doing damage and so forth, operating from concealment, like I said, and sort of working as a kind of a mini cruiser in that regard, I think is potentially going to be an issue, although that is going to be the way I think that a lot of players might get their damage in. The other opportunity, again, is working in sort of an ambush mode and being able to go after targets that are isolated. But ideally, you're not like going after an isolated target that's not playing to the objective, and you just want to hunt them down just for the sake of hunting them down. So we will have to see. So that's kind of my initial thoughts on this. My biggest beef with the parameters of the ship is really the maneuverability. Again, I think the lack of engine boost, the horrifically terrible turreting circle radii, the weak rudder shift, I think it's really going to like cut into at least the quality of life, the in some sense the enjoyment of playing these ships. And that is the part that I kind of give me the biggest concern for the vessels. Now, as part of this new tree, will be a new premium, or new branch, will be a new premium Tier 8 destroyer, the ZF2. This is based on a Lahadi class destroyer from the French that was captured by the Germans in the early part of World War II. So this is a French hull with German armament, basically. She will have better concealment than the Tech Tree German destroyers that I just talked about, and she will fire 128 millimeter guns. But otherwise is going to have a slightly different characteristic. So let me jump down to her specifications. Much smaller hit point pool for the tier at 16,700. Now that's not bad for a destroyer, but it's atypically small for a German destroyer, which tend to have very large hit point pools. There's no indication here whether she is going to have a similar, quote, great armor profile like the other new Tech Tree German destroyers, so we'll have to see about that. Again, she fires 5 128 millimeter guns, slightly unusual turret structure, similar to the Z-23, just smaller caliber. So a double rifle turret up front, and then 3 single rifles as you go down the ship. The firing range will be 11.9 kilometers. HE alpha is pretty anemic at 1450, and the shell velocity is okay at 880 meters per second. That's not straight up railguns, but they're going to be relatively quick to target, that leading targets and aiming correctly shouldn't be too bad. AP alpha is very good at 2950 per shell. Reload will be 6.5 seconds, and that will be a little bit of an issue if this ship were to try to combat other destroyers. So 6.5 seconds is anywhere from about 20 to 80% slower, or not 80, but 50% slower than many of her peers, which have reloads at 4 seconds and getting down to 3 seconds. So she will have to pick her fights carefully, again, if these parameters are to hold the way they are. Dispersion is not the god tier dispersion of the Tech Tree destroyers. At 104 meters per second, 104 meters at maximum range, that's pretty typical, and the Sigma remains very good at 2.0. She has 2 quadruple launchers. These are identical to the other torpedoes, or the torpedoes on the other ships. The only difference is that these torpedoes are listed as 1 knot slower than the other Tech Tree destroyers that we just talked about. So I don't know if this is a typo or whatever. AA is unremarkable. Again, the short range is okay, and the medium is pretty mediocre, and the long range is poor. And the maximum range here isn't quite 6.9, it's 6, which is still pretty strong for a destroyer. But again, I don't see this ship as shooting down a lot of planes. She's not going to be very strong from that perspective. She has a maximum speed of 35 knots, which seems a little bit counterintuitive. If this is supposed to be a French hull, does that mean the power plant is German and therefore she doesn't get French speed? I don't know. Turning circle is better than the other German destroyers at 670 meters, and the rudder isn't too bad. It's at 3.9 seconds. Kind of the cutoff for me is 4 seconds, where it goes from being okay to not being very good. Surface detection will be quite good at best at 5.8 kilometers. So she will definitely be able to stealth around more easily and be able to outspot many of her peers at that tier. As far as consumables, damage control, obviously, and she will get German hydro. Her gimmick is going to be the main battery reload booster. Reload, or the duration, will be 15 seconds, which means she should be able to get off 4 to 5 salvos per use of the reload booster. All right, so that is the news on the German destroyers. There are a couple of other ships I'm going to get to here in just a second, but one final thought on this. I am looking forward to the German destroyers. Frankly, all new lines I look forward to, and it may require some creative thinking about how to play certain ships well. Again, my biggest beef is really going to be with the maneuverability of these ships. The other aspects of the ship I feel like I could probably work with pretty well. All right, let me get to the last two ships listed in this article. First is the premium Tier 7 Japanese battleship Hyuga. This is a part of the Fuso class of battleships. She will be at Tier 7, however. She has a somewhat different artillery layout and somewhat different speed, torpedo protection, etc. And she will have good accuracy and range, as well as a quicker reload than the Fuso. At Tier 5, we have the Royal Navy battleship Agincourt. This will be a ship with a relatively short, in fact, quite short main battery firing range, but pretty long range secondaries. And she has a big broadside. She has 14 guns. So these are 305 millimeter guns. So a pretty big broadside for a Tier 5 battleship. So taking look at more at the specifications here. The Japanese battleship has a good hit point pool at Tier 7 at 60,700. That's quite solid. The plating at 60 millimeters doesn't make sense to me. Tier 7 battleships tend to have 19 or 26 millimeter plating. So I don't know if this is intended, if this is either a typo, this is supposed to be 26 instead of 16, or whether she's a glass cannon. I don't know. She has these, or very similar, 12 356 millimeter guns as the Fuso. Firing range is excellent at 21.3 kilometers. The shells for the AP are actually quite strong in terms of the alpha at 10,200. Shell ballistics on the AP are pretty floaty, 775 meters per second, but Japanese shells tend to be pretty linear time to target. They don't lose as much speed over distance as, again, with like a lot of German ships. So players that are comfortable with playing the Japanese battleships should be pretty comfortable with that. Dispersion's okay at 237 meters at maximum range, and the Sigma is okay at 1.0. Let's see. AA is pretty unremarkable. In fact, it's actually pretty poor. She has only short and long range, and the hit points per second are pretty poor. Maximum speed is okay, 25.3 knots. That's not straight up dreadnought slow, but it's still not very quick either. Turning circle is good. 750 meters is pretty good for a battleship, and it's better than most of the new German destroyers that have been announced. And rudder is okay at 15 seconds. Best concealment is going to be about, I didn't do the exact calculation, but best concealment is going to be probably about 14 kilometers, which is not bad. She does get damage control, obviously, and repair party, and she gets a spotting aircraft. Now for the Agincourt, her hit point pool is pretty average for the tier at 48,400. Again, plating 19 millimeters. I don't know if this is right. Usually Tier 5 battleships have 16 millimeter bows and sterns, so I don't know if this is either a typo or it's a reflection that the ship is somewhat more durable. than some of their peers. I don't know. Again, she fires 14 305 millimeter guns. The range is quite poor, at least per these current specifications at 15.3 kilometers. And the shells are pretty quick at 831 meters per second, and the alpha for both the HE and AP are decent. I'm assuming that she will receive the 1/4 penetration buff on her HE because she is a Royal Navy battleship. There's no indication in this article either way, but I think that's probably a fair assumption. Dispersion is okay at 213 meters at maximum range, and Sigma is pretty good at 1.8. Secondaries, her base secondary range is 5.5 kilometers, which is stronger than most Tier 5 battleships. This is the same base range as on the Oklahoma. And if she does indeed get the 1/4 penetration on her HE, these secondaries could be potentially pretty effective in close quarters. And given the limited maximum firing range of the main battery, it may be intended that the ship is more of a brawler than many of her peers. Speed is pretty sluggish, 22 knots. Again, that's not the worst in the game, but it is, and it is a dreadnought, but it is still going to be pretty sluggish. Turning circle is quite strong at 670 meters, and rudder is pretty good at 13.4 seconds. Best concealment is actually not too bad. If base concealment is 12.2, best concealment will be below 11 kilometers, so which is pretty strong. Again, all of these parameters are initial, so these are certainly going to undergo some changes during their testing. And then lastly, for consumables, damage control and repair party, and she does not have access to a spotter plane. So that is my assessment of this development blog article, and especially, like I said, the new German destroyers that have been announced. I am certainly looking forward to these ships, and I know other people have some reservations, but I think that Wargaming will probably make some adjustments, just my personal speculation, to make sure that these ships are reasonably attractive to play and aren't going to be perceived as unpleasant or anything like that. So, but we'll just have to see how things go. So I hope you found my opinion and input here useful and interesting. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, we hope to see you out there on the virtual seas, and we wish you happy sailing.